It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. This is part two with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. We're talking about the escalating conflict between the U.S. and China over the South China Sea. Colonel, let me ask you, based on the news this week with the U.S. Navy sailing two warships towards those islands claimed by China, China calling that a provocation and issuing a warning to the U.S. Meanwhile, you have a Philippine official saying the Philippines are prepared to go to war if necessary. That comes in response to criticism that Duterte has been weak when it comes to standing up to China on the South China Sea. Do the developments of this week, especially with the U.S. sending these warships, does that signal an escalation, a dangerous one?
I think it signals a situation, not necessarily an escalation, but I think it signals a situation that, as you implied, is fraught with danger. Duterte has been all over the map with regard to Beijing and Washington. Why he suddenly has decided that he's going to side more or less with Washington or provoke Washington into doing something is beyond me. I felt like he was trying to balance the situation originally with Beijing, which I was in favor of, but now it looks like he's going the other way. The same goes for the other countries in the region. They are willing to die to the last dead, to fight to the last dead American. There's no way the Philippines are going to stand up to China or Vietnam unless it's a land-based situation, as Vietnam demonstrated post the Vietnam War when they gave China a bloody nose when China tried to teach them a lesson, as it were. But Vietnam ultimately, too, as populous as Vietnam is not going to stand up in a war of attrition with China. No one in the region is going to stand up to China in a war of attrition, which China would make it be ultimately if its real strategic interests were at stake. So this is really not in anyone's favor to be baiting China on behalf of bilateral or even a multilateral relationship with the United States. But to your main point, the United States should be very careful about how it exercises freedom of navigation. I haven't seen the tracks. I don't know what the ship tracks are. But were I doing it, I would be exercising FON, as we call it, with a wide berth to the places where the Chinese are, emphasizing the point that I'm not trying to provoke China, while at the same time, I am trying to assert general freedom of navigation rights through the South China Sea. What do I mean by that? I wouldn't be sailing within 12 miles of one of the most fortified areas in the region by China. I suspect that's what we've done. I suspect that's the reason the Chinese counterstatement was so rough, that we sailed very close to that island, asserting not just freedom of navigation rights, but asserting that that territory was not Chinese. Now, we might want to do that from time to time, but on a frequent basis, I would question our doing that. And then the other aspect of this that truly bothers me is that under President Trump, and I have to say under Secretary Mattis, because he's still working for President Trump, we don't seem to want to talk to anyone anymore. Diplomacy has died. We brag, we shout, we tweet, we do everything other than diplomacy. We sail warships, possibly within the 12-mile limit. We say things like Mattis just said, but we don't talk. We don't talk to Iran. We don't talk to China, except to say that, we're going to do this or we're going to do that with regard to a trade war or whatever. We should be talking. We should be sitting down and talking.
Colonel, let me put to you what I think would be a counter argument to that, which is that other countries in the region have tried to bring this issue to international arbitration. The Philippines won a judgment against China in 2016, but China has ignored it. And so based on that, one can say, well, look, China's even been ignoring international law, international judgments. So how can we negotiate with it?
Well, you have a good point within the post-World War II existing regime, including the regime of the International Court of Arbitration, international law in general, and so forth. But that's changing. And we must face the fact that China is changing it almost single-handedly and changing it in ways that favor it. And I would point out, too, that the United States has owned, more or less, the regime I just referred to, the one that's existed since 1945, from the International Monetary Fund to the World Court System. And what that has meant is, for example, that particular verdict you're referring to went much wider of its writ than was necessary. It even declared the -9 line that China claims, however arbitrarily, null and void, as I remember the verdict. So they went well beyond the simple dispute with the Philippines, and they probably did that under the influence of the United States. The United States uses the IMF, it uses the World Bank, it uses the International Criminal Court even to do things that it wants done in the world. Well, China is standing up, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong. China is standing up and saying enough. We're sick and tired of the United States, through its international institutions, dictating to the rest of the world, sanctioning the rest of the world, telling the rest of the world what it can do and what it can't do, and so forth. And by the way, with Donald Trump, our European allies are beginning to do the same thing. Japan will do the same thing very shortly. They're a little more circumspect about the way they go about it. But this is happening. And to not confront this and to not face it, to simply say, well, we're going to sail ships wherever we want to sail ships and so forth and so on, is a little bit ludicrous. We've got to recognize that the world is changing. We've got to recognize that our power has been diminished tremendously since 1945. We've got to understand that China they're fabricating, building, getting others to buy into international institutions too. The most prominent of which of late, of course, has been the Asia Development Bank, which we stupidly refuse to join. The way to influence something like that is to join it, not ostracize it. So the world's changing. I might not like it. You might not like it. 330 million Americans might not like it, but 1.4 billion Chinese are changing the world, and they're changing it faster than we can keep up. Do we want to, in the middle of these changes, which are inevitable, do we want to pick a fight with China? I would suggest that if we're going to do that, we'd best be very, very careful about the strategic circumstances under which we pick it. And the last place I would pick it is in China's home ground.
Worth pointing out, I think, just that whether one agrees with what China is doing in the South China Sea or not, you don't have to support it to also recognize that China is not interfering or intervening, for example, to get the U.S. to give Guantanamo Bay back to Cuba in its waters. China is focused on waters that are off its coast, whether it has a legitimate claim there or not. Right of time, though, so we'll final comments, Colonel Wilkerson.
You're absolutely right. And as I've said many times before, I think even to you on one occasion, wait until we see a Chinese striking group, naval striking group, sail into the Gulf of Mexico on a routine basis. It's coming, and they'll be 12 miles off the coast of Texas. It's coming.
Well, on that ominous note, we'll leave it there. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, now a distinguished professor at the College of William and Mary. Colonel, thank you.
Thanks for having me here.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.